I think that stories are the primary way that we teach and learn from each other. The storytellers convince us to see the world in certain ways. Storytellers teach us things, and the stories that we come to love are how we relate to the world around us. Right now, people are telling some really awful stories that are completely wrong. In particular, so many people seem to be compelled to puke up ridiculous arguments about how Palestinians could behave better while negotiating the terms of their own genocide. A lot of people seem driven to call what Israel is doing self-defense. And because of that, I think people are seeing extra credence in the suggestion that, Palestinians' imperfect victimhood justifies what's happening to them. You can see what the problem with this perspective is when you approach it like a story. The story of Israel carpet bombing Gaza and then arming settlers in the West Bank to just go and kill every Palestinian they see, and every country in the world with money and power giving Israel carte blanche and extra arms to just fucking go for it. That story begins on October 7th, when Hamas pops into this dimension inexplicably, just outside of history, and just kills 1,400 people. It doesn't begin with Hamas busting down a fence that was encircling over 2 million people who had themselves been bombed for 15 years. It doesn't begin with the preceding 75 decades of violence against Palestinians. It doesn't begin with Israel killing shit tons of Palestinians. No, it magically begins with Hamas poofing into the world, the essence of terror. I don't want people to fucking die. At the same time, something that's also true is oppressed people have a right to resist their oppression. And it's becoming clearer and clearer to me every day that there are tons of people who would have probably condemned, like, Nelson Mandela for resisting apartheid. Some people only know that certain things in history were bad because those stories seem to be over. So they've got the ending of the story, but they're not able to follow along when it's happening in front of their own bare eyeballs. I am in agreement with Israeli academic Ilan Pappe. He says that Israel has created mythology that, quote, refuses to allow Palestinians even a modicum of moral right to resist colonization. He makes this point in a book that's free, I'll link it below, that Palestinians' resistance has always been framed as a hatred towards Jewish people. And this is in spite of the fact that early testimonials from Zionists state that Palestinians were initially very welcoming to Jewish settlers. It was only once Palestinians started to be brutalized that's when you started to actually see anger and violence in reaction to Zionism. So the story of violence against Israelis begins with the establishment of an ethnostate in historic Palestine in 1948. And the reason for that is there is no way to non-violently establish an ethnostate. Ash Sarkar of Novara Media put it best, I think, when she said that Israel has created these conditions that are unsafe for even its own citizens. There's one scholar that I found who points out that ethnostates cannot be democratic because, the establishment and maintenance of an ethnostate requires privileging one group over all others. It is an inherently violent process to establish and maintain an ethnostate. The moment that Israel was declared to be an ethnostate was the moment that people first articulated a commitment to being violent towards Palestinians. Once that happened, tens of thousands of Palestinians were killed. Hundreds of thousands, close to 1 million Palestinians were displaced. And now millions of Palestinians around the world are not allowed to go home. On top of the fact that thousands of Palestinians are still murdered, every couple of years. And this month, we've seen over 8,000 Palestinians killed. This is an extension of the violence that began in the early 20th century. all of the onus to make peace happen has been on Israel. All of the power to make peace has been in Israel's hands. Because before the establishment of the State of Israel, the Palestinians in the nation of Palestine were not doing anything to invite violence upon themselves. They weren't doing anything that you could interpret as an act of aggression besides existing on the land. You can see that it is ludicrous to say that if only Palestinians had just been peaceful at that time, if only they had not been so violent, then the rest of the violence that followed wouldn't have happened. You would never say that, right? So it's ludicrous to say that Hamas's violence was this inciting incident. It doesn't make any fucking sense. This is also why, the two-state solution was always the equivalent of just giving Palestinians the middle finger and then acting surprised when people were offended by it. Under a two-state solution, Israel gets to keep all the arable land, the coast, and it never has to make reparations. It never has to give Palestinians back the homes that were stolen from them, the homes that they still have keys to, that they still have deeds to the land for. Under a two-state solution, Israel never has to reckon with its violent foundations. The things that happen to Palestinians, which directly rhyme with what happened to Jewish people during the Holocaust, never have to be rectified. Nothing ever has to be undone under something like a two-state solution. The problem with this narrative that Israel is defending itself is that it's just ahistorical. It assumes that violence from colonized people comes from nowhere. It erases the act of colonization and doesn't put any of the responsibility for that colonization in the hands of the colonizers. One thing I realized early on in my education about Palestine through, taking in Palestinian stories was that as Israel's colonial regime concretized, what happened is the horizons for Palestinians just got narrower and narrower and closer to the violent core of Israel as a state, right? And so what happens in that situation is all of your prospects as a colonized person are limited to violence. When the state permits random fucking people from New York to coming into your house and just taking it, when the state arrests children, when it sends tanks to villages of people who have nothing more than rocks to fight back with, when everybody has had their lives touched by this violence or ruined by this violence, what the fuck else are you supposed to do? How would you deal with the pervasive violence in your life and in the lives of everybody around you? How would you deal with violence defining your life? How do you react to that? How can you take that peacefully? There was one way to prevent the violence of October 7th, and it was for Israel to end apartheid, to stop colonizing Palestinians, to free Palestine. That would have prevented the violence. So my education on Palestine began 7 or 8 years ago. And I was taught by someone who is an anti-Zionist Jewish person. I didn't learn from Palestinians about what's happening to Palestine. But I did learn through, taking in Palestinian stories. I was lucky that my teacher was so critical because there was no propaganda for me to really work through. The bare facts were presented to me, and I didn't have to square that against some faulty story that I'd been told for most of my life. Something that's always stood out to me from the beginning of my education about Palestine is the raw numbers. A lot of people like to think of this as two comparably empowered entities in the middle of a battle that spans millennia. But there have been exponentially more Palestinians killed over the past century than Israelis. Israel is one of the world's leading exporters in arms. On top of the astronomical death tolls, right? What stands out is the stuff that Israel can do to Palestine that Palestine cannot do to Israel. So people have been talking a lot about how, like Israel shut off the water and electricity in Gaza. That's just the tip of the iceberg. In the 90s, it came out that Israel had been harvesting organs from Palestinians' corpses without the knowledge or consent of their families. Palestinians are not allowed to walk on the same streets or sidewalks in places where they share the space with Israelis. Recently, there was an incident where Palestinian school children had their textbooks confiscated by the IDF because they had images of the Palestinian flag in them. Israel has set up a system of checkpoints throughout Palestine on top of the blockade that prevents people from leaving Gaza. And those checkpoints are used to essentially terrorize Palestinians on a day-to-day basis. People will commute out of their community in the West Bank to go work because most of the jobs are in Israel. And they can be held up for 4 hours sometimes, just for no reason. There's no way to plan your day around this. You just might not be able to live your life normally. Palestinians' homes will just get demolished by settlers at times, on top of settlers just, coming into people's houses and just calling them theirs and then being enabled to do that by the IDF. Olive trees have a lot of significance to Palestinians. Many olive groves have been cultivated across generations by Palestinians, and the oil from the olives is a really important economic resource to a lot of Palestinians. And for a long time, Israel has just fucking destroyed these olive trees. Joe Sacco's Palestine talks a bit about this. Like pretty much any actually account of what has happened to Palestinians talks about what Israel does to the olive groves. They'll uproot hundreds of thousands of trees, and some of these trees are, again, generations old. They're very resilient, so they're optimal for the desert climate. The olive trees are not members of Hamas. They're just important and valuable to Palestinians, and Israelis destroy them. On top of all of that, during peaceful protests, Palestinians are still brutalized or murdered. There was very famously the Great March of Return in 2018, where every Friday, Gazans would go walk to the fence encircling the open-air prison that is Gaza to protest the conditions they were living in. And on the whole, just like Black Lives Matter protests in the United States and Canada, these protests were peaceful. Hundreds were killed by the IDF because the soldiers just opened fire on these protests. One popular narrative with Israelis right now is that the carpet bombing is a way to get Hamas. Eventually, there won't be any more Hamas, and then it'll just be the peaceful Palestinian governments left over. And there's a politician named Hanan Ashwari, and I think she was formerly a member of the PLO. She said, first of all, you can't eradicate Hamas. It's this complex movement. At the end of the day, it's Israel that's draining credibility from these pacifistic organizations like the PA, because Hamas seems to be the only entity standing up to Israel. Israel's continued violence makes these pacifistic organizations look ineffectual, if you're just some random Palestinian person, how are you going to be convinced to support an organization that is primarily focused on peacefully negotiating your way out of oppression, when what you're experiencing is police brutality constantly and the destruction of your ways of life? How could you be convinced to support that group? Because that's going to look absurd. It's going to sound absurd. I couldn't be convinced to support a group like that, that's insisting on peaceful process if I were in that position. Because the violence that I'm experiencing on a day-to-day basis is directly contradicting the suggestion that you can peacefully resolve colonization. Israel is what is making Hamas happen. Israel and the continued violence that it is enacting against Palestinians is lending further credence to militant approaches to resisting oppression. I obviously, like everybody else, watched Piers Morgan's interview with Bassem Youssef, and there was something Piers Morgan said that made me really, really upset.
How do you forge peace between two warring parts of that region who, for decades, have approached peace, in my view, with mutual sledgehammers, with no actual desire to have peace. And I think it comes down in the end to great leadership. And I don't think there's great leadership. I don't think, well, hang on, let me make my point. I don't think there's great leadership on either side. Where is the Nelson Mandela figure here?
He's asking Bassem Youssef, like, where's the Nelson Mandela of Palestine? Like, why hasn't Palestine come up with this more pacifistic individual? Where is this icon of peace and liberation in Palestine? And the answer is in prison. The Nelson Mandela of Palestine is in prison. Like, I'm not being facetious. Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for 27 years during apartheid because he tried to sabotage the apartheid government. Like, he tried to resist violently his oppression. He was released in 1990 because de Klerk, the then president of South Africa, was getting a little bit antsy, and he thought that this might, de-escalate tensions as like a show of goodwill towards people who were opposed to apartheid if he released Nelson Mandela. And it was after that point that Nelson Mandela was able to become Nelson Mandela, this representative of the reconciliation of South Africa. Like, you don't have the Truth and Reconciliation era Nelson Mandela without the Nelson Mandela who resisted apartheid. You don't have Truth and Reconciliation Nelson Mandela without Nelson Mandela being released from fucking prison, right? It wasn't on Black people to produce this figure who symbolized liberation from apartheid under peaceful conditions. Like, the last move to creating Nelson Mandela was in the hands of the apartheid state. And once they fucking released him, once they stopped violently subjugating people, that's when Nelson Mandela was able to be Nelson Mandela. And the irony to Pierre's question is that Israel has in its custody over 10,000 Palestinian political prisoners. There are thousands of Palestinian Nelson Mandelas just in Israel's hands right now, being held hostage by Israel. So, if you want the Nelson Mandela of Palestine, take your pick. Release any of those 10,000 people, and we'll see which one becomes Nelson Mandela. Because some of them were arrested for, fucking throwing a rock. And I think Nelson Mandela did a little bit more than throw a rock when he was arrested and put in prison. So maybe those people will be super Nelson Mandelas because they were a little bit less extreme. This was such a shockingly fucking ridiculous thing to say. And obviously I shouldn't be surprised that it's coming from this empty exoskeleton. But this reiterated for me that the story that we're telling is full of contradictions, and we're just all okay with that. There's nothing that Palestinians could do that's right in the eyes of Israel and its supporters. They're only going to be people who deserve the violence, because the people with the widest platforms on the planet are always going to blame Palestine for things it has no control over. We need the Nelson Mandela of Palestine, so why haven't you just released all of the Palestinian political prisoners from Israel's custody? Palestine, it's your fault. Israel is ethnically cleansing and genociding Palestinians to make room for settlers. Why were you just not there in 1948? Why couldn't you have just not been there? So I've seen a lot in the past month that's altered me on a fundamental level. As I'm sure all of us have. I saw a video of a man carrying his loved one's body parts in a plastic bag. Just yesterday I saw footage of a little girl with her bones sticking out of her flesh. I can't even fathom the pain that people are in physically, and to have that laid over top of generations of psychological torture and anguish. I can't even fathom what that must be like. Where Israel and its cringe-ass state social media accounts are celebrating the death that Israel's military is bringing down upon Gazans. Really early on, Gazans seemed resigned to the fact that they were probably going to die. Barcelona is the sister city of Gaza, and there were some municipal leaders in Gaza who sent a message to Barcelona when the bombings started, like in really like full force, a couple of days into the siege. I think it was October 13th. And so this is the message that they sent. I don't know if we'll be able to stay in contact in the coming days. So please tell the coming generations about us, if we're not existing anymore, how beautiful and lovely the people of Palestine were, and how affiliated they were to their land and case. Thank you very much. It was my pleasure to work with you during the last years, along with your colleagues. May God rest us in peace. The thing that I've noticed is how often Palestinians have had to beg for their stories to just be told, and for how long they've had to do that. It's just so fucked up. That request is so small, like just to tell our story. It makes me so angry that the one story that we're telling instead is about how there's nothing that Palestinians could do that's right.
It does seem that the civil war, has been quite fruitless.
It's not a civil war. It's a people defending themselves against a fascist government, which you are defending because just King Hussein has an Arab passport. It's not a civil war.
Well, the conflict...
It's not a conflict. It's a liberation movement fighting for justice.
Well, whatever it might be best called...
It's not whatever, because this is where the problems start. Because this is what makes you ask all your questions. This is exactly where the problems start. This is a people who is discriminated, is fighting for his rights. This is a story.